Okay, we're going to talk about queen versus pawn on the 7th. And we're going to get a couple easy questions out of the way first. You might be wondering why we're talking about a queen against a pawn when a queen is so much more valuable than a pawn, so much more powerful. And you might be wondering why we're talking about a pawn on the 7th rank in particular, as opposed to on the 2nd through 6th. The reason we're talking about a queen is that this type of endgame usually results from a pawn endgame in which there's a race to see who can promote first. And when you promote in that type of endgame, there's almost never cause to promote to anything other than a queen. And if the players promote on back-to-back moves, the game will usually result in a draw, because the player with the initiative can't do anything with his extra move to either force the win of the enemy queen or deliver checkmate, unless it's a very specific situation or the defender makes a very bad move. And the reason we're talking about a pawn on the 7th rank is that in order to even make this a contest, the white king has to be able to hold on to the pawn and hold on to the queening square. If he can't do both of those things, it's typically a very easy win for the guy with the queen. For example, here, black has a pawn on b2, which is adequately, for now, defended by the king on c3. But the king has no hope of also guarding the queening square on b8. So winning this for black is as simple as moving the queen to that square. Queen g8, for example, b4, queen b8. And we can give white a whole bunch of free moves: king c4, king g2, b5, king h1, king c5, king g2, b6, king h1, king c6, king g2, b7. And the point of these moves is to show you that even if white gets his pawn all the way up to b7, there's no way for the white king to take control of the queening square and facilitate the queening of the pawn, which means that the win for black is as simple as approaching with the king and winning the white pawn or delivering checkmate. There are even situations in which the defender's king is close to his pawn and close to the queening square, even one square away from being able to defend that square, but the position is still easily won for the guy with the queen. And that's because he can simultaneously take control of, or threaten to move to, the queening square and stop the defender's king from using the one square he has to also control the queening square. Here, queen f4 wins immediately. White cannot play king c7 in order to guard b8, so after he makes some move, it doesn't matter what, king d7, black plays queen b8, and once again we're in a situation in which the white king will never be able to force the b-pawn to queen. For example, king f3, king b6, king e4, king a6, king d5, king b6, king d6, king a6, king c6. And here white must abandon the defense of his pawn. So it's only a contest if the white king can defend his pawn and defend the queening square. And assuming that that's the case, which we'll do from this point on in this discussion, whether or not the position is winning for the side that has the queen depends upon which file the defender's pawn is on. I've introduced you in the past to the fact that rook pawns are more drawish than other pawns. And that holds here. There are plenty of rook pawn positions that are drawn. But it's also the case that if the defender has a bishop pawn, meaning a pawn on the c file or the f file, the game is likely to result in a draw. The winning situations are those in which the attacker's pawn is on the b file, the d file, the e file, or the g file. Okay, so on to the next step. How do we know how to win a pawn? How to win the game in this situation? How do we affect the winning of the white pawn and then deliver checkmate? And the answer is that well, actually, first let's go over some things that don't work. If black just starts checking the white king, queen g7 check, king c8, queen f8 check, king c7, queen f7, why f7? Doesn't matter. King c8, queen e8 check, king c7, queen e7 check. Black, at least so far, has not made progress toward winning the white pawn. White simply moves out of check, and if black captures this pawn with his queen, the game obviously results in a draw. And if black takes the time to try to introduce his king, with king g2, hoping to get the king all the way up the board so that he can play queen takes b7 safely. White, of course, just queens his pawn, and the game is likely to end in a draw. So how do we get black to be able to move his king without allowing white to queen his pawn? We can't really do it with a check, because in order to place the white king in check, it's almost definitely the case that the previous unit for black that moved has to be the queen. But we want it to be the king. So it turns out that the way you do this is by getting the white king to step in front of his own pawn. If we can get the white king to the b8 square, we'll be guaranteed that on the following move, white will not queen his pawn, which will give us a move to advance our king. And the next important thing to look at is this very important position in which the attacker's queen is forking the pawn by being diagonally behind it and the defender's king. And the reason this position is important is that it's one in which the defender has no choice if he wants to hold on to his pawn other than to play king d8, stepping in front of the pawn, which gives black time to play king g2, and there's no d8 queen, because unfortunately for white, that square is occupied by the king. And I would like to give you a technique that you can use to get immediately back to this position, this critical position in which the black queen is diagonally behind the white pawn, forking it and the white king. Now there's probably more than one technique you can use, so I'll give you mine, and if you have your own, you can use that instead. It's no big deal. First of all, white should not play king c8. That is suboptimal because it walks into an absolute pin, which means white is still not able to play d8, which means black has more time to advance with his king. So white should play king c7, which threatens d8, and now begins the sequence that I'm going to introduce you to. The first move is a pin. It's an absolute pin. White is no longer threatening d8 because the white d-pawn is pinned to the king on c7. White advances his king to c8. It doesn't make any sense for white to play king c6 for the reasons stated earlier. It loses control of the queening square, which allows queen d8, which wins easily for black. So white plays king c8, and the second step is to check the white king from behind. You don't want to check him on the 8th rank because that will allow d8 queen in response, which will cause the game shortly to end in a draw. So black should play queen to c5 check. And here, king d8 would be a mistake, of course, stepping in front of the pawn, giving black a chance to advance with his king. So white should be placing his king on the b8 or the b7 square. Let's say king b7, for example. The next step for black is to place his queen on the square behind the defender's pawn, obviously attacking that pawn and x-raying the queening square, preventing white from playing d8. On top of that, black threatens to take the pawn, of course, so white's only defensive resource is king c8, defending the pawn and covering the queening square. But this allows you to re-establish that critical position with queen to c6 check, diagonally behind the pawn, attacking that pawn and the enemy king. And here white's only defensive try is to play king d8. King b8 would lose the pawn, so he plays king d8, and black gets a chance to advance with his king. Let's take a look at that sequence a little bit more quickly. Black pins, checks, attacks, and checks. And he's reestablished this position and now has a chance to advance with his king. Pin, check, attack, check, and he gets a chance to advance with his king. And once the king gets very close, you may no longer have that sequence of moves, but you'll have some way to force the winning of the game. So let's say pin here, the white king steps on e8, black can't play queen to e5 check, but he has a couple ways to win. I think one of them is just the move e6, and now if white plays d8 queen, queen f7 is checkmate. If white plays d8 equals knight check, white gets a check, but a knight won't last for very long against a queen. And if black wants to, he can play queen c6, pinning the pawn, and then once white relieves the pin with king to e7, black can just play queen to e6 check, forcing king d8, and after king d6, black will play queen takes d7 check. So that sequence again is, after you advance with your king, pin, check, attack, and check. And the white king is forced to step back in front of the pawn, giving you time to advance your king. You repeat this process enough times that eventually your king gets close enough that you can calculate some kind of checkmate or calculate a way to win the pawn. All right, I mentioned earlier that though knight pawns, B and G file pawns, D file pawns, and E file pawns allow the person with the queen to win, the defender has drawing chances if he has a bishop pawn or a rook pawn, especially if he has a bishop pawn, because there's a particular trick in this queen versus pawn on the 7th endgame when it's a bishop pawn that's not available in other situations. Black can achieve this important position, queen to b6 check, with the fork I mentioned earlier, seemingly forcing white to play king c8, stepping in front of his pawn. But unfortunately for black, white instead has the move queen to a8. And now white's pawn is en prise, but if black takes it, the game ends in stalemate. White has no legal moves. And it turns out that there's not much black can do about that. After queen to b6 check, king a8, black can deliver some more checks. Queen a6 check, king b8, queen b6 check, king a8, queen a6 check, king b8. He can make a pin, queen d6, king b7. He can pin again, queen d7, king b8. But if he ever checks along the 8th rank, the response will be c8 queen. And if he ever gets back to that critical position I mentioned before, queen b6 check, white will respond not with king c8, but with king a8. Okay, and that brings us to, I think, the most complicated part of the analysis of queen versus pawn on the 7th. And that's queen versus a rook pawn on the 7th. And the reason this is complicated is that there's a certain stalemate trick for the defender. Let me show you that. Queen to b6 check. And now white doesn't want to play king c8 or he'll lose his pawn, so he's compelled to step in front of the pawn with king to a8. But the problem now is that there is no escape square for the white king. So after king g2, white has no legal moves and the game ends in a draw. Whereas if this were a b-file pawn, white would be playing the move king a7. And so that's not very complicated, right? And most of us are taught this when we're new to chess. We're taught that queen versus pawn on the 7th is a draw if it's a rook pawn or a bishop pawn. But the reason this is a complicated discussion is that rook pawns turn out to be... there are plenty of positions in which a rook pawn can be won against. If we draw a square that includes the queening square of the pawn, and that's 5 by 5, and then we exclude the corner opposite the queening square, it turns out that if the attacker's king is anywhere within that square, again minus the corner opposite the queening square, the position is winning for the side with the queen, even though it looks like in some cases the king is too far away to provide help. In this position, black's king is on a4, which means he's within our box: a4, b4, c4, d4, e5, e6, e7, e8. The black king is anywhere on these circles or closer to the white pawn. The position should be winning for black. And so I'm going to show you one position in which the black king is on a4 and one position in which the black king is on e8 to show you what the technique is from each side, because it's slightly different. When the king is on a4 or b4 or c4 or d4, you follow the following list of steps. You put your queen on the 7th rank with tempo. Here you play queen g8 check, king b7, and you can play queen h7, queen g7, queen f7, it doesn't matter. So let's play queen h7 just to prove that. White plays king to b8. Notice that he doesn't have any other options. If he plays king to c8, black will snag this pawn on a7. And if he plays the mildly interesting looking king b6, black has a couple of ways to put his queen on the long diagonal, guarding b7 and a8, and his next move will be queen to a8, which will result in an easy win for black. So white must play king b8, threatening a8 queen. And the second step is to advance with your king, even though it looks like your king is too far away. In fact, to be dramatic, we can even have black advance in a way that allows white to queen with check. King to a5. White now plays a8 queen, check. Black plays king b6. And it's white's turn to move, and he has a queen. But it turns out that there's nothing he can do to avoid checkmate. The white queen cannot check the black king on a7, b7, c6, a6, a5, because all of those squares are either guarded by the black king or guarded by both the black king and the black queen. And there's nothing that white can do to stop the possible checkmates for black. Black threatens, for example, the move queen to a8 checkmate, which white can stop with queen a1. But then black gets to choose between queen g8 checkmate and queen b7 checkmate. And white can guard the b8 square, but then black has, again, queen b7 checkmate, or queen a8 leads to mate in 2 after white gives up his queen. So this black king looks pretty far away, and you can even allow white to queen with check. But it turns out to be winning as long as you follow that list of steps I gave you. Again, the list is put your queen on the 7th rank with tempo, then advance your king toward, in this case, the b6 square. If we were dealing with a pawn on h7, it would be the g6 square. And if this were white going after a pawn on h2, it would be the g3 square. Pawn on a2, the b3 square. So you advance your king a5 or king b5. White queens, in this case with check. Black plays king b6. And white is, if he's never seen this before, stunned by the fact that despite having the move and having a queen, there's nothing he can do. And this is a good technique to use if your king, is anywhere on this side of the box I showed you earlier. Whereas if he's on the side that's made up of the squares e8, e7, e6, and e5, we get this type of position, and you should follow a little bit of a different order of instructions. Again, you want to put your queen on the 7th rank with tempo. Here you can't do that with queen g8 check, because white will immediately queen his pawn, because queen g8 is not a check. But there's always going to be a way to do it. So here, for example, we can play queen to b6 check. White plays king a8, and white says, please advance your king so that this results in stalemate. But black can just go forward with his plan to put the queen on the 7th with tempo. Queen d8 check, king b7. And now black can play queen d7 or queen e7. Again, let's go with the farther square to show you that it doesn't matter. Queen e7 check, king to b8. Just to drive home the point, white should not play king b6 here, because after queen to e4, black guards both a8 and b7, and after his next move, queen to a8, the win will be easy. So white plays king b8, threatening a8 queen. And black's next step is simply to advance his king in a way that guards the c7 square, and that allows his queen to still move there on the following turn. So black plays king d8, and now white gets to queen again. Yay. But black plays queen to c7, checkmate. So it turns out that queen versus rook pawn on the 7th is more complicated than we're led to believe when we're new to chess. Yes, there are many positions that are drawn, but there are some that are not. And those are when the attacker's king is anywhere within this 5x5 box, excluding the corner square opposite the queening square for the white pawn. And the reason that that square is excluded is that black can neither guard c7 in a single move with his king, nor step on b6 in 2 moves with his king, and he'd have to be able to do one of those in order to win. Okay, and to round out our discussion, let's talk about why it's not really challenging when white has a pawn that's not on the 7th rank. And the answer is that you can at least use the techniques we've already gone over to achieve the same thing. So here black can, he immediately has queen c5 check, arriving at our important position. But let's just say he has to play queen g7 check for some reason, king c6, queen to f6 check, king c7, queen to, let's go with e7 check, king c6, and let's say queen to e5 threatens to put the queen on the b8 square. White has no choice but to play king b7, and black is all... One of my cats just messed up the webcam. One of my... sorry. And white is already forced to step on the square in front of his pawn, allowing the black king to make progress. White can emerge from in front of his pawn, and all black has to do is find a series of checks that gets him back to some position like this one, in which white must step on the square in front of his pawn. It is important to remember that you should try to be on the square, one of the squares diagonally behind the opponent's pawn while checking him, so that he can't play this move king b8. If you were checking him from a4, for example, he'd be able to play king b8, his next move would be b7, and while that wouldn't change the outcome with perfect play by both players, in this case, because it's a b pawn, it might if it were a c pawn or an a pawn. So just remember that it's ideal to be checking the opponent's king from a square diagonally behind his pawn. Alrighty. That's queen versus pawn on the 7th. Let me know if you have any questions. And this, for now, rounds out our discussion of pawn endings. I think next time I'll move on to talking about basic rook endgames. Thanks a lot. Bye.